Now tell me how you got interested in journalism.
Well, I think I always liked to write. And then when I found that I could get things that I wrote printed and have my name on it, then I got interested. And the first example that I remember was I did a little report on a book that I had read for class called Ben and Me. And it was a story of Benjamin Franklin and his pet mouse. And the mouse told the story, and he told the story about uh, Franklin and electricity and watching the key go down the kite, the kite string. Uh, that little report got into a mimeographed school paper and had my name under it. So that was my first byline. Uh, that's a little silly, but the beginning happened because, again, in school, grade school, maybe sixth or seventh grade, and I wrote a piece, school assignment about Native Americans and how they lived. And I don't know, I probably got most of the information from the library, but I remembered my mother was always one for us to learn by seeing things. And we went on a vacation to Allegheny State Park in New York, sort of in the western part of New York State. And next to it was an Indian reservation. And when we were there, we went and visited the Indian reservation. My recollection is that the piece that I wrote was about the Iroquois Indians who lived in New York State. And anyway, the teacher liked it. So she told me, by way of sort of encouraging me, she says, you know, there are people that make a living by writing. They're called journalists. And I always remembered that. It was like the perfect, the flash of light. I think I got interested in journalism by doing it. And I got involved in all publications that I could get involved with. The newspaper that the Scout Camp published during the summer. When I got to high school, following up on, there are people called journalists, I looked up the moderator of the high school newspaper. His name was, he was a newly ordained priest. It was a Catholic high school. His name was Father Joe McCarthy. And he became my trainer. He taught me everything I knew or was to learn about journalism, how to write, how to interview, what you could say, what you couldn't. All these good basics. And he taught me about how to lay out a newspaper, or pages of a newspaper, and how to write headlines, and that we could make changes in a print shop right before, as the paper was being printed. Learned all that stuff from him. And on the basis of doing all of that and being enthusiastic and interested, I became the editor-in-chief of the paper in my senior year. When I got to college, I went to Holy Cross College, and the first thing I did was to make a beeline to the campus paper, and I told them I wanted to be involved, and I told them what I had experienced in high school. They needed a layout editor. I was kind of hired on the spot. And that got me involved with the college paper. So what I did in college was a rerun of the experience in high school, except in the college, the students ran the paper more than in high school. So that's how I got started. That probably was not terribly different from other people of my generation, but I still am a great believer in that people learn journalism by doing it.
So now, what was the professional news media that you first worked for? What professional news organization did you first work for?
My first job was with the Wall Street Journal, but before that, I was a newspaper boy. First, I had one route, then I had two routes, and I worked for the local daily paper, the Reporter-Dispatch, and the Standard Star. Reporter-Dispatch, you know about, and the Macy chain that owned those papers and others, I think sold out to Grant Gannett. I was delivering papers. I wasn't doing any in the news office business. The worst thing that happened, I always have to tell you the worst. One of the ways I would get around on my route was to go through a field, and one twilight afternoon, a skunk got me. I mean, it got me big time. I was covered. How I got to the Wall Street Journal is there was a fellow that worked with me on the high school paper, and he went to Ohio State, I think, and studied journalism. I'm not absolutely sure, but it was Ohio State, but I think it was. And he, part of the working, as I was studying at the journalism school, was to work in the field. So he was actually doing reporting when I met him at a Christmas party in 1956. So we were talking, and I asked him how you get a job in this field. So he said that he heard that the Wall Street Journal was interested in hiring liberal arts college graduates, and that it was paying them $100 a week. Wow. In those days, it was a lot. I immediately followed up, and I wrote Warren Phillips, who was the managing editor, and his secretary wrote me back and sent me a nice letter, and she said, she confirmed what my friend had told me, but she said, you know, almost as a cautionary, she said, last year we had 400 applicants and we hired 20. So I pursued anyway. I got an interview with Warren Phillips at what was the equivalent of our spring break. It was at Easter time. And the interview went well. And he, in fact, offered me a job. And it startled me a little bit because I had an appointment with Time magazine the next day. So I said, I'll get right back to you. And I went to Time magazine, and the interviewer sort of got on me by saying that he thought I would, I did think it was a little arrogant for me to be applying to Time magazine right out of college and wanting to go from the AAA minors to the major leagues. And so I said, well, then he said, maybe we can get you on our in-house publication for employees, and we'll find out what you can do working for that. So I said, you know what? I think I'm going to accept the job the Wall Street Journal offered me yesterday. That was kind of a flip answer to him, but he gave it to me. So that's how I got started. Got hired by the Wall Street Journal. Now, at the time, the Korean War draft was still in place. So anybody that was coming out of school had to expect a question in a job interview. Well, what are you going to do about your military obligation? Well, I learned that Secretary McNamara Defense had created an option to the draft, which was a Army Reserve program, which had 6 months of active duty, and then 5.5 years of going to weekly meetings, and 2 weeks in the summer of going for training. So I said that I told Warren Phillips that's what I was going to do. I didn't have any idea whether I could get into it or whether there was any problem. But anyway, when you're a college senior, you're full of yourself and you assume you can do everything. So anyway, that's how I got things settled with the Wall Street Journal. I actually started with the paper in February. I graduated in May or June, and the following February I was finished my military, and I went to work in the New York office of the Wall Street Journal, and I worked for Wall Street Journal and its publisher, the Dow Jones, for 41 years, and that's the only place I ever worked. Mm-hmm. So it was a good run.
And what kinds of jobs did you hold? Where did your career with the Wall Street Journal take you?
The first part of it was in the New York office, and the first job in particular, the Wall Street Journal believed very strongly in the idea of training its old reporters and doing it by pairing a new reporter or a younger reporter with a more experienced one. And so my first job was to work for the man who was the bond editor. He covered all of what happened in the bond markets. There was another editor who covered the stock market. And they tried to run brand new people through one or the other so that it could learn the difference between a stock and a bond, No, I mean, but seriously, and to pay attention to a lot of basic things that maybe somebody coming out of college wouldn't know. Pat Carberry, the bond editor, was a stickler for making sure that there were no mistakes in numbers in the paper. So what he did with new reporters like me was he made us put a check mark over every number that was in a story and that would indicate that we had double-checked the number. Well, you can imagine a lot of the young reporters didn't like that. They hated it. But I found that there was another benefit for working with Pat Carberry, which is that his desk and typewriter were situated in a way so that he could see the entrance to the managing editor's office. And while he was doing his work, he kept an eye on who was going in and out of Warren Phillips' office. And he always had an idea of why they went in, what was happening. And his batting average was very, very high. He really had very good ideas. So what I learned from him on that score was how the place worked. Who was getting ahead, who wasn't, and why. I mean, that was a great insight in your first job. After working for Carberry for a year, and by the way, it took 9 months, I think, before I got my first byline. It was on a kind of a big wrap-up story that was tied to election on bond initiatives. But anyway, after the first year, I was moved to a series of beats that were covering industries and the companies that were in the industries. And I did that over the next 6 or 7 years. Covered clothing makers, textile business, cigarette makers. Cigarette makers at the time when the first health warning came out. It's a great place to be. And the assignment that really was the big challenge was I covered real estate and construction. And real estate partnerships became publicly owned companies. The bookkeeping was hard to understand. And there were a lot of promoters who took care of themselves. So there were a lot of stories. And it was an area that was not heavily covered by other publications. So I was finding things to write about and getting kind of exclusives because other people weren't doing maybe what they should have been doing. Anyway, my work was noticed, and some people who were senior news people, Ed Koenig in particular, Fred Taylor, they became interested in me, and the bureau chief's job in Detroit became open. The bureau chief was moved to Washington. So they asked me to go to Detroit as bureau chief. In the Wall Street Journal, that was a big assignment. The auto industry was a huge part of the economy. The auto companies, the big 3 auto companies, were highly successful, but they were facing a lot of troubles. A lot of things were happening. So they wanted someone who had dealt with digging out information and could defend what was being published. That's the kind of person they wanted to be there. So we went at the worst possible time for Joan and me. Joan was pregnant with our 4th child, who hadn't arrived at the time we were supposed to move. I negotiated a little delay in the timing, so the delivery actually took place before we went. But she got to Detroit with 4 youngsters and didn't know a soul. So, but she's a tough lady, and she managed as she's always managed. So, you wanted to know what else I did?
Yeah. What?
After, by the way, we'll come back to this. While I was there, the first summer, there was racial disturbances in Detroit. The next summer, there was the Detroit riot, and 43 people died. We can talk about that a bit in a minute, but you wanted to know what else I did at the Journal and Dow Jones. And after 8 years in Detroit, it wasn't that I didn't want to move. It was, I always say, when the managing editor said, well, what else you want to do? You know, I said, anything that's more fun than what I'm doing. He didn't have anything. He had been in Detroit as a bureau chief. He knew what a great job it was. So anyway, after 8 years, he called me one afternoon and said, look, I really need help here. And he was asking me to come back to New York to work for him as assistant managing editor. So I didn't own my job. I knew my time was up. And so we made the move. And for the next 3 years, I did all sorts of things for him. And they weren't as much fun as what I was doing in Detroit, but they were the job. Mm-hmm. And after 3 years, I was named managing editor. He became executive editor. I was managing editor for 6 years. And after that, Warren Phillips, who had hired me, was asked. He asked me to work for the company, dealing with news-related issues that affected all of the publications, not just the Wall Street Journal. The number one issue was, he said, we have on paper a very strong commitment to diversify the news staff. The results of that are not as good as what's on paper. I want you to fix that. And he asked me to do other things, but he made it clear that the most important thing that he wanted me to do was to work on diversity.
Now, was that the first time you got involved with diversity efforts at the company?
It was the first time in dealing with for the company. And I did that for 6 or 7 years. And then I actually retired, except they asked me to stay on as a paid consultant, doing many of the same things that I was doing, and I continued to help out on the diversity issue. Mm-hmm.
So if you outline some of the things that you did related to diversity, for instance.
Well, how I became a candidate in a sense because I was in Detroit at the time. Detroit had difficulty, and it was clear that we were having the same kinds of problems that other newspapers were having in covering the story because we didn't have minorities on the staff. And I continued to help out on the diversity issue. So I had a little kind of incident that happened to me when I was in the Army Reserve uh, that I later thought about. And part of the Army Reserve training was in Columbia, South Carolina at Fort Jackson. And in my growing up, I have to say that, I grew up in white neighborhoods, and my education was in schools that were mostly white. Uh, so I didn't have a lot of personal experience with people who were black or Hispanic or Asian American. So when I get to South Carolina, the Army is integrated. President Truman took care of that. South Carolina was not. So here I'm living in a tent. Half of the soldiers that are in the tent are black. Half of them are white, Southern white, and me. And it was more of an observational situation for me than anything else. The soldiers got along fine. I mean, they weren't necessarily buddy-buddy, but there wasn't friction. Now, I can't say that when I went out into Columbia that I personally observed a lot of troubles, but there was tension in the air. And I got to know a white family who took in soldiers on the weekend to give them a Sunday dinner, white family. And they exposed me to Southern hospitality charm, but they also gave me an earful on how those people in the North really don't understand us. They don't understand that whites and blacks get along fine in the South. And, I didn't get into any arguments, but I've got firsthand what the party line was. So I thought about that, and was at the same time I was there, Little Rock happened, and of course that was the government sending troops to enforce a court order to integrate the Little Rock schools. It was the big news story. The Wall Street Journal was sending me the Wall Street Journal while I was in the Army. So I would get the paper every day. It was wrapped in a brown wrapper, fortunately. I put it inside my shirt. And then I would read the paper in the library when I got a chance. Well, here I see on the front page of the Wall Street Journal a whole bunch of stories related to race relations in the South, stories triggered by Little Rock. Well, I was very impressed that here was a paper I was going to go to work for, was writing about what I thought was the right stuff to be writing about. But later I thought about it, what they wrote. And the stories were good. They tended to be analytical. They didn't have a lot of anecdotes in them. And I thought about that. The obvious point was they were written by white reporters, good reporters, but they couldn't get to various people to talk to them the same way that if they had black reporters as part of the team. I mean, I'm not saying that I had that idea immediately. It's just over time that became clear to me. 10 years later, when I'm in Detroit and we're dealing with the aftermath of the Detroit riot, it was not an academic issue anymore to me. It was a real issue. And Ed Coney and Fred Taylor had been working to find black reporters who were experienced to join the journal staff. And they succeeded in hiring two people. One, Art Sears, who worked in our New York bureau, and the other one was Ken Field, who came to work with us in Detroit. Both of them had some experience with covering the riots that had taken place in other cities. And it was interesting to see how Ken Field fit in or didn't in our bureau in Detroit. I think the reporters tried to be warm and welcoming to him. I don't know that he always felt comfortable. He often referred to us, to the people on the staff of the bureau as you, you know, and I mean that's tough stuff, you know. He's in a new job, even though he's an experienced reporter, a new job, and really he knows he's there to help the bureau find stories that they might not have been able to do themselves. So that was my first experience with the question of staffing and the difficulties that minorities might feel when they're working in a staff that is mostly white. It got me thinking about that whole issue. When Warren Phillips asked me to fix diversity at Dow Jones, in the newsrooms in Dow Jones, he didn't tell me what to do. He didn't tell me any measuring sticks that were going to be applied to what progress we may or may not have made. So it was up to me. And I said, well, first thing I know is we can't wait for applications to come in the mail. We got to get the hell out of the office, go places where we might find candidates. And I also said, you know, I think I would really be helped if I could persuade a minority staffer to work with me for 1 year and be replaced by another, so that when I went to places where there would be possible candidates, the face of the Wall Street Journal, Dow Jones, would be the institutional face, me, and someone who was like the people who were being interviewed. And that staffer could answer the questions that the person who talked to me might have been reluctant to ask. And I thought that was a good way to go and a good system. And we got a lot of interest when we went to job fairs and other things, other places. Because I think, you know, without any announcement, people got the idea. Here was a guy who had been the managing editor of the Wall Street Journal, so he must be a senior person. And here's a black or Hispanic or whatever person coming with him, and he or she is there to kind of answer those questions that you really want to know. So that was the plan, and I never changed it. And I started with Addie Rimmer, who had earned her stripes at the Wall Street Journal and was known in the minority community. And the last person I had was Ave Delph, who actually worked on our financial wire service. Was very effective in talking to people, and a lot of good people along the way, including Carolyn Phillips and Michael Crawford.
So what do you think your triumphs were? What were your challenges in your approach in trying to improve diversity?
Well, the obvious challenge was to convince people that we really were interested in hiring them, and that when they were hired, they were being hired on their journalistic skills, not the color of their skin. And because of their upbringing, they would bring something to the table in terms of questions that they could ask and issues to pursue. Interestingly, that was always the tradition at the Wall Street Journal. We were a national paper, but we had a national hiring policy. And our bureau chiefs were very active in hiring people for the staff. It's just that for reasons that are not totally clear to me, that system didn't result in the hiring of black reporters or Hispanic reporters or Asian. Actually, we did hire Asian reporters when we created an Asian edition. But in terms of the domestic paper, that wasn't happening. And it wasn't happening also, and this was very clear to Phillips, it wasn't happening at our other publications like Barron's. And the community papers that we owned at the time, the Ottawa newspapers, there was very little diversity of those staffs. So, I mean, it should have been obvious. It wasn't. Maybe we were at the front end of the process of being aware, because people like Ed Codian and Fred Taylor and Phillips were very much on the cutting edge of the thinking of American newspaper editors. And they were active in the American Society of Newspaper Editors. Both Phillips and Coney were presidents of it. So, and I remember when I was managing editor of the paper that Coney would, who was basically a supporter of me, and he would give me the business every so often on, well, what are you doing about hiring minorities? You know, where are they? What's going on? So it was totally fair for Phillips to present me after I had been managing editor of the paper with, as a key assignment, solving the problem I hadn't solved as managing editor. I think that's exactly what happened.
So talk about your involvement with American Society of News Editors and then the Dow Jones News Fund, and how you kind of rolled into that diversity role.
My involvement with the Society of Newspaper Editors, so I was a member. They had a diversity committee. Big issue was what was the goal of the diversity committee, and they decided that by the year 2000, the population of minorities in newsrooms should be equal to the percentage of the population of those groups in the whole society. Well, there was progress made, but it was not going to get us to where we, to that goal at the rate that it was going. So there was much debate about, well, should we lower the bar so that, we wouldn't be doomed to failure. And I guess I was feeling, no, you keep the bar as high as it is. Just start figuring out how to make more progress. Obviously, not every news organization was as committed as others were. Very fortunate for me that I worked for a place that was committed. And I think one of its commitments was the creation of the Dow Jones Newspaper Fund, which was just originally set up to stimulate interest among young people in journalism. But in 1970, it took a major change in focus and put much emphasis on attracting high school and college minority students into journalism and creating programs to make that happen. I became at one point president of the newspaper fund, and I always thought that this is amazing. This is a very small operation, but look what it's doing. It's really good. And working with the newspaper fund dovetailed with my assignment when I was the associate editor. Because I was meeting people, and I was involved in the training of people, all of which I think was needed by the whole industry. Now, parts of the industry did do that, and I think the Freedom Forum made great commitments to do that. Night Organization did. The McCormick Tribune. So there were things going on, but it wasn't wall to wall. Not everybody was aboard.
You took a particular interest in the high school workshop program.
Well, I thought that was just absolutely right on, because many of the kids that got involved in the high school program didn't grow up in a house like I did. My dad's generation they were readers of newspapers. New York had a lot of newspapers. And so lunchtime was reading papers, and sometimes going into the garbage can, pulling out papers to read. And then because he had a long commute, he'd bring the papers home. So I was in a house where newspapers were and where I got to see them and I read them. Not every kid who got involved in our summer programs came from the same kind of household. gets back to my earlier point that you get interested in newspapering by doing newspapering. And those workshops were brilliant. They gave the kids that came to the program the opportunity to work with professionals, to work with very good journalism teachers, and to create a newspaper during the time of the workshop. That was as good as anything that I had happened to me in high school, and I thought I was lucky to have happened, but did happen. So I thought they were good. And I know the stresses and strains on budgets all over the place, and some of the support that the workshops have gotten in the past, maybe they're not getting right now. But I hope the commitment to having those high school workshops never ends. It will be opening the door for kids who didn't have it otherwise. And I think working with print, even though some people have questions about the future of print, I think working with print is great. I can learn the electronic, digital, all the rest of it as they go along, and they will, because kids are great at teaching themselves that stuff. They need a little help when it comes to putting out a publication that has to be done by a certain date, and it has to have so much information on so many pages. That's a great experience. It's a real production. So I always tried to visit as many of the workshops as I could. I hoped that I was able to inspire the kids, that the way I started it is similar to what you're doing right now. In fact, I thought much of what I did when I was working on diversity was cheerleading. There was a lot of discouragement, a lot of feeling. They're saying they want us, but they don't really. Where are the jobs? They don't bring us in. They don't do any training inside. They expect you to have gone to journalism school or having worked for other papers before you can apply. And I just remembered I didn't have anything when I got to the Wall Street Journal. They took a chance on me. And I think, if you asked other people my age how they got into the business, after you get past their, I was Superman, they would tell the same story, that papers took chances on them.
I'll talk a little bit about your involvement with the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, because you actually had the Wall Street Journal print the student newspaper for NAHJ, and that was really significant for that organization.
In my whole career in journalism, I was fortunate to be at the right place at the right time. When I started recruiting for Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones, Hispanic journalists were starting to organize themselves. First happened in California with the California Chicano News Media Association. And they started to have job fairs. So I said, that's a great opportunity for us. So we went and we got to know a lot of people. then the guy who created that organization created the national organization, National Association of Hispanic Journalists. And so the process that was in California started to become national. There was another thing happening that was related, which is the training program that Rich Holden used to get involved with in the summer, which had a lot of Hispanics in it, and he used to meet at they had their sessions at the University of Arizona in Tucson.
The Maynard Institute for Journalism Education.
Yes, right. And so all of those things were blossoming at the time I was getting involved. So I went to all of them and I got to know the people. And I think a real opening was happening for Hispanic journalists. Although I go this a little aside, Frank Del Olmo was involved in a newspaper fund, one of its first programs, which was to support college students who got summer internships. And he was in part of that program. And that meant he was early into newspaper programs, into newspapers who were hiring Hispanics. And of course, he had a career that took him well up into the Los Angeles Times. And he came onto our board years later, the newspaper fund board. Maybe the first Hispanic on our board, I'm not sure. The specific thing that you mentioned about the convention newspapers, that was an idea of Maggie Rivas and a few others, which was a great training experience. I got involved with the Latino Reporter, a convention newspaper that the Hispanic journalists were going to have at their convention in Dallas in 1988. It was the idea of Maggie Rivas and a couple of other members of the organization that they could get students to cover the convention and to produce a paper on a daily basis while the convention was going on. It was a brilliant idea. It was all of what we've talked about before, about getting kids to do it. The problem was getting it printed. And she couldn't work anything out with the Dallas papers, or the Fort Worth paper. For reasons I can't remember, I was at a board meeting that they had, the Hispanic journalists had in Hartford, Connecticut, and Maggie talked about the problem that they were having with this project, which was to get the paper printed. So I said, I think maybe I could help with that. Well, I didn't really know whether I could, but I knew we had a printing plant in Dallas. So I went back and worked it through the channels in the paper. And lo and behold, it turned out it would be possible for us to print the paper in our Dallas plant. And we did. And and it's true that there was some inconvenience, at least, involved because people who worked in the printing operation of the paper ended up staying longer than they might have because the convention paper was not as good at meeting deadlines as the Wall Street Journal staffers were. At any rate, they put up with that for 3 or 4 days to publish the paper. And the people who put in the overtime took great pride in this. They thought this was terrific. They said, you know, here are kids putting out a newspaper for a convention that's going on in town. Now, were those staffers who were in the printing plant Hispanics? Not at all. In fact, most of them had never dealt with Hispanic kids before. But they saw what was happening and they bought into it. And I think one of the things that made it go down well was at the end of the convention, the Hispanic youngsters brought dolls, cloth dolls, in and gave them to the staff members. I mean, it was stunning. It was just wonderful. People in the printing operation who had worked on the project had a souvenir from the kids, and to me, it just said major things about what could happen. The question, you know, is, well, who paid for this? You know, and I said, I never experienced any complaints. I did hear that the staffers worked longer hours, but nobody said, you know, can't have that happen. I think it was just, this is okay. And if you want to be involved in it, you can be involved in it. I don't think any of the people in the printing operation were forced to do anything. And of course, they knew that it wouldn't be forever. So now, I had the notion after the paper came out, and it was a great success, that this project was something that editors should know about. And I knew that the newspaper editors were having their convention shortly after that, a couple months later. So I said, maybe we could get Maggie to go to the convention and tell people about it. I happen to know the editor of the Dallas Morning News, Burl Osborne, because I had been a Pulitzer Prize juror, one of the people that reads the entries with him. A year or two before that, I can't remember exactly when. Anyway, so I called him. And I said, do you think Maggie could go to the convention, which was wherever it was? I don't remember where, so that she could tell about this project. And he said yes. That was it. You know, she got flown over and back. She may well have spoken to the diversity committee, but what I remember is she spoke to the whole convention. Now, she didn't get much time, you know, maybe 4 or 5 minutes to tell her story. But to me, it was great because it got the idea out there. And that convention newspaper project, I think, still goes on. It was one of the really good things, and good experience for the kids, good for the journalists who worked with the kids, good for anybody who was at the convention and who saw the paper later as it was brought around. So there was a feeling at the time of, why not? Why don't we try things? Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. And some newspaper organizations were willing to go along with that within some limits. I never felt that there were a lot of constraints on me. Maybe I'm sort of cautious by nature, and so I don't press the outer limits anyway, but I was very happy to be involved in that. And I mean, when I look back at the time when I was doing the diversity efforts for Dow Jones, I would say that was one of the highlights.
Well, when you look at the journalists of color organizations, all of them have a student newspaper project now. And at one point, ASNE had a student newspaper project at its own convention that was staffed by students of color. And you remember Rich Holden was always the copy desk chief for that project.
Right.
So that kind of...
The idea kind of spread
across the industry, and as you say, it still goes on.
I think any time you can get younger, less experienced, inexperienced people in contact with seasoned people, and particularly people who are deeply committed to journalism and deeply committed to young people having opportunity, that's the mix you need. You know, it's not the only one. I realize there's a lot that goes on in journalism education. It's other than that. But being a great subscriber of the idea that you learn by doing it, that you learn by being in contact with the experienced people, that's good.
Mm-hmm. So what do you see as the future of diversity in the news media, taking into account all the pressures that we see and the tremendous changes? What happens if diversity takes a back seat?
I was looking at some of the numbers, you know, from ASNE, which does an annual survey to find out what's happening in the industry. It's been doing that for many years, and it's the yardstick, and the numbers are mostly believable because, you know, it's a peer, people looking at each other, and if somebody kind of inflated numbers and people knew that that wasn't so, they would be discredited. I mean, I think it's a pretty good system. The numbers, when I was looking at the numbers recently, the thing that struck me was up until 2008, the numbers were inching up. They weren't making any great leaps forward, but they weren't going down. And then 2008, they hit the wall. Now, what was happening in newspaper companies wasn't just a newspaper industry problem. It was happening everywhere. But then when you look at the numbers since 2008, they kind of have, more or less leveled off at a lower level. And they haven't gotten back to where they were. And that's disturbing to me. the Now, I know a lot of things have happened in American industry and the American economy. There's been a lot of effort to eliminate jobs rather than create them. And I think within the newspaper industry, if it's ever going to reach the commitment of trying to have full diversity, something that matches the whole society, then the process has to get revved up again. It has to be new leadership, new commitment. It has to become the highest priority within newspaper companies that it was, which is why the progress was made in the first place. It has to be part of the commitment of the Newspaper Editors Society and the newspaper publishers. A lot of people have to kind of buy in again. And it's new people. It's people that didn't grow up with this. They were around in the summer of, 1968. And I think it can happen. And I think there are people of goodwill who can make it happen. There's also bottom line pressures that can work against it. There've always been bottom line pressures. There are people in the newspaper industry who faced that years and years ago, and they just did what they thought was the right thing to do. You can be discouraged by what's happened in the last 5 years, or longer than that now. But you never give up. Journalists are skeptics and hard-nosed realists, but they wouldn't be doing what they do if they didn't have hope. That's what's needed at this point in time, I think. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed this kind of reminiscing.